The year is 2006, and the world of investigative journalist Elias Vance has shrunk to the size of his small apartment, a space that smells of stale coffee and aging paper. Walls that should hold art or family photos are instead a chaotic mosaic of maps of the Black Ridge National Forest, coroner's reports from 1979, and faded photographs of smiling boys in scout uniforms. His daily routine is a ritual of obsession. He rises before dawn, poring over the same scant details, searching for a single thread that might unravel the 27-year-old mystery. At the center of his desk, a single protected photograph stands apart. A 10-year-old boy with a familiar grin, his brother David. Elias was only 5 when David vanished, and his life since has been a relentless, ghost-haunted quest for answers that the world had long ago given up on. Flashing back to the warm, golden light of a July afternoon in 1979, the air in Black Ridge Forest was alive with a different kind of energy. The excited chatter of 15 boys from Pathfinder Scout Troop 114 echoed through the pines as they set up their green canvas tents in a secluded meadow. Scoutmaster Miller, a patient man with a kind face weathered by years of outdoor life, demonstrated the proper way to tie a bowline knot, his voice a comforting baritone against the backdrop of crackling firewood. His assistant, a younger man named Peterson, helped the boys gather kindling. Among them, David Vance was a beacon of enthusiasm, his eyes wide with the thrill of adventure. He was the epitome of youthful innocence, living in a moment of pure camaraderie, completely unaware that this idyllic scene was the final entry in his life's journal. The Black Ridge National Forest itself was a silent, ancient observer of this fleeting moment of joy. It was a place of deep primordial beauty and unsettling secrets. The canopy of the old-growth trees was so dense that it cast the forest floor in a perpetual twilight, even at midday. Locals spoke of it in hushed tones, trading stories of strange lights, disorienting sounds, and hikers who had walked into the woods never to be seen again. The meadow the scouts chose, while beautiful, felt like a small, vulnerable island in a vast, indifferent sea of green and shadow. The very air seemed heavy with the weight of unspoken history, and the silence between the chirping of birds was profound, a deep and unnerving quiet that seemed to swallow sound whole. That final evening, normality was a thick, comforting blanket. The scouts sat cross-legged around a roaring campfire, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames as they roasted marshmallows and told ghost stories that elicited more laughter than fear. The smell of burning pine and sizzling sugar filled the air. Scoutmaster Miller made his final scheduled radio check-in, his voice calm and clear over the crackle of the static. "All is well at Camp Pathfinder," he reported to the ranger station miles away. "Boys are settling in for the night. Weather's holding, over and out." As the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, it painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, casting long skeletal shadows that crept slowly and deliberately toward the lone circle of light and life. 27 years later, in a sterile, fluorescent-lit office, Detective Isabella Rossi viewed the world through a lens of hard facts and verifiable evidence. Her desk was an organized landscape of active cases, burglaries, assaults, and disputes that had clear motives and logical conclusions. The Pathfinder disappearance was nothing more than a ghost story, a dusty 3-box file in the cold case archives she had never had a reason to open. She was a pragmatist, a woman who believed that every mystery had a rational explanation, however deeply buried. The idea of people simply vanishing into thin air was the stuff of fiction, not a line item in a police budget. Her focus was on the living, on the solvable crimes of the present, not on the faded tragedies of a generation past. The fragile peace of both their worlds was shattered by a single, unexpected phone call. Elias was tracing a contour line on a topographical map when his phone buzzed, the caller ID displaying the Black Ridge County Sheriff's Department. His heart hammered against his ribs, a familiar painful mix of dread and a hope he thought had died long ago. A geological survey team for a logging company had detected a significant man-made anomaly underground, not far from the original campsite. At the same moment, Detective Rossi answered her desk phone, her initial sigh of annoyance at the mention of a decades-old case quickly dissolving into sharp professional focus. A long dormant wound was about to be torn open, and the silence of the forest was finally ready to be broken. The campfire had dwindled to a glowing heart of embers, pulsing softly in the encroaching darkness of Black Ridge Forest. Inside their canvas tents, the boys of Pathfinder Troop 114 whispered and giggled, their voices muffled by the fabric, slowly succumbing to the exhaustion of a day filled with adventure. Scoutmaster Miller, having made his rounds and ensured every flap was secure, took one last look at the star-dusted sky. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. Yet a subtle change was occurring. The familiar chorus of crickets and frogs began to fade, not abruptly, but as if a dimmer switch were being slowly turned, leaving behind a silence that was deeper and more absolute than mere quiet. Tucked into his sleeping bag, 10-year-old David Vance found sleep elusive. The excitement of the trip still buzzed under his skin. It was then that he first perceived it, a low resonant hum that seemed to bypass his ears and vibrate directly in the bones of his skull. It wasn't the drone of an engine or the buzz of an insect. It felt ancient, geological, as if the very bedrock beneath them was awakening. A sudden unnatural chill seeped into the tent, raising goosebumps on his arms. He noticed the complete absence of sound from outside. The forest, which had been a symphony of nocturnal life just moments before, had fallen utterly, unnervingly silent. Curiosity overpowering his unease, David cautiously unzipped the tent flap, peering into the moonless night. The embers of the fire were now cold and dark. In their place, a soft, ethereal light pulsed from the center of the meadow. It was a lambent blue-green glow, like captured foxfire, casting no distinct shadows but illuminating the surrounding tents in a ghostly luminescence. It didn't feel threatening. Instead, he felt a strange, magnetic pull, a serene and irresistible curiosity that quieted the frantic beating of his heart. Without a conscious decision, he pushed the flap aside and stepped out onto the cold, dew-kissed grass, his bare feet making no sound. He wasn't the first. One by one from the other tents, the rest of the scouts emerged, their movements slow and synchronized, as if in a shared dream. Their faces, bathed in the strange light, were placid and empty of fear, their eyes wide and fixed on the phenomenon. Soon after, Scoutmaster Miller and his assistant Peterson appeared, their expressions a mixture of confusion and awe. But they made no move to stop the boys. They too were caught in the silent, invisible current. The entire troop, 17 souls in all, moved with a quiet purpose toward the pulsing light, forming a loose, silent circle around its epicenter in the heart of the clearing. As they drew closer, the low hum intensified, a physical pressure that resonated in their chests and made the air feel thick and heavy. The light grew in concert with the sound, shifting from a soft glow to a brilliant, contained column that reached up toward the starless sky. It wrapped around them like a shroud, cool and weightless. Through its shimmering veil, the familiar shapes of the forest, the dark sentinels of the pines, the jagged line of the ridge, began to blur and recede, as if they were looking through water. Time itself seemed to stretch and thin, each moment suspended in an eternal, silent present, the world they knew dissolving around them. Then, without a sound, the light flared into a single blinding pulse of pure white. For a fraction of a second, Every tree, every rock, every blade of grass in the meadow was etched in stark, brilliant detail. Just as quickly, it contracted into a pinpoint and vanished, plunging the clearing back into absolute darkness. The oppressive hum was gone. A gentle breeze rustled the tent flaps, carrying the familiar scent of pine. Slowly, tentatively, the crickets resumed their chirping, their song filling a void that was now not just silent, but empty. The meadow was exactly as it had been, save for the complete and total absence of 17 human beings. At the Black Ridge Ranger Station, miles from the silent meadow, Ranger Henderson glanced at the clock on the wall. 10:03 p.m. He tapped his pen on the logbook, a small frown creasing his brow. Scoutmaster Miller was always on time with his 10 p.m. check-in. Henderson keyed the microphone, his voice cutting through the radio's gentle static. "Camp Pathfinder, this is Ranger Station, requesting status check." "Over." He was met with a wall of white noise. He tried again, enunciating each word more clearly. "Scoutmaster Miller, do you copy?" The silence that answered was deeper this time, more absolute. He logged it as a possible equipment malfunction, but a cold tendril of unease began to wrap itself around his heart. By late the next afternoon, with the troop hours overdue and all radio calls unanswered, a full-scale search was initiated. A young, sharp-eyed Sheriff Brody led the first team into the forest. As they neared the designated campsite, a profound quiet greeted them, a stark contrast to the expected sounds of teenage boys packing up. From the edge of the clearing, the scene looked deceptively normal, a cluster of green tents against a backdrop of towering pines. But the stillness was what struck Brody as profoundly wrong. It was the heavy, expectant silence of a place that had been abruptly abandoned, a quiet that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. Brody's boots made the only sound as he walked into the center of the camp. The scene was a perfectly preserved moment of time, a modern-day Pompeii. A checkerboard sat on a stump, the game unfinished. A jacket was draped over a log, as if its owner had just taken it off, and would be back any second. He peered inside one of the tents. A comic book lay open on a pillow, its pages still crisp. The embers in the fire pit were cold and gray, but a pot of beans sat beside it, untouched. This wasn't the scene of a panicked flight or a violent attack. It was a place where reality had simply been punctured, and everyone had fallen through. The methodical search that followed only deepened the mystery. Brody's deputies inventoried every item, finding nothing missing but the people themselves. Sleeping bags were laid out, backpacks were filled with supplies, and canteens were full of water. Crucially, there were no tracks leading out of the meadow. The damp earth around the camp was pristine, showing only the footprints of the scouts within the perimeter. There was no sign of an animal attack, no evidence of a struggle, no discarded items from a hasty departure. It was as if the ground had opened up and swallowed them, or they had been plucked from the sky, leaving not a single trace behind. Standing amidst the silent tents, Sheriff Brody felt a chilling sensation he had never experienced in his years of law enforcement. This wasn't a case of missing persons. It was an enigma, a tear in the fabric of the logical world he inhabited. He had dealt with the grim certainties of crime and accident, but this was a void of information, a perfect vacuum of evidence. He gazed up at the dense canopy of the ancient trees, feeling as though the forest itself was a silent, complicit witness, its secrets locked behind a wall of impenetrable green. The weight of 17 vanished lives settled on his shoulders, a burden of unanswered questions he knew would haunt him forever. The news hit the nearby town of Silver Creek like a physical blow, spreading from house to house through hushed phone calls and frantic whispers. For the families of the missing, it was the beginning of a nightmare from which they would never truly awaken. In the Vance household, the ringing of the telephone was a shrill harbinger of doom. The clipped, professional voice on the other end delivered the incomprehensible news. David and the entire troop were gone. The word missing hung in the air, a sterile, meaningless label for the raw, gaping wound that had just been torn in their lives. Awakened by his mother's first choked sob, 5-year-old Elias lay in his bed, listening to a sound of grief so profound it would embed itself in his memory and shape the very course of his existence. The years that immediately followed the disappearance were a cruel, drawn-out torment for the families of Troop 114. The initial hurricane of media attention and nationwide searches eventually subsided, replaced by a deafening silence that was far more painful than the noise. Hope, a flickering candle in the storm of uncertainty, was slowly extinguished by the relentless passage of seasons. Each passing year carved deeper lines of grief into the faces of the parents, transforming their homes into quiet mausoleums of memory. The mystery of Black Ridge Forest solidified from a current event into a piece of tragic local folklore, a cautionary tale whispered to children, while the families were left to navigate an endless, private purgatory of not knowing. For Elias Vance, childhood was a ghost story he lived inside. He grew up in a house where his brother's absence was a physical presence, a vacant chair at the dinner table, a bedroom door that was always kept closed but never locked. His parents' grief was the very air he breathed. His mother's quiet, constant weeping and his father's hollowed-out silence created a landscape of sorrow. He learned about David not through shared experiences, but through the artifacts of a life cut short. A worn baseball glove, a collection of bottle caps, and fading photographs of a smiling boy he could barely remember. He was tethered to a specter, forever chasing the memory of a brother he never truly knew. The weight of the tragedy fractured the Vance family in different ways. Elias's mother clung to a desperate, almost mystical hope, preserving David's room as a perfect shrine, convinced that to change anything would be to accept he was never coming back. His father, however, crumbled inward. He buried his grief under a mountain of stoic denial, refusing to speak David's name, unable to face the gaping wound at the center of their lives. This schism of coping created an emotional chasm in the home, leaving young Elias to navigate the treacherous space between a mother lost in the past and a father who refused to acknowledge it, forcing him to process his own loss in lonely isolation. In the town of Silver Creek, the collective memory began to fray at the edges. The yellow ribbons tied to oak trees faded and were eventually taken down. The annual candlelight vigils saw fewer and fewer attendees each year until they stopped altogether. The Pathfinder disappearance became a dark chapter in the town's history, a story that new residents learned about with a distant, morbid curiosity. For the world, the 17 souls who vanished in Black Ridge were a statistical anomaly, a cold case file gathering dust. But for the families left behind, time did not heal the wound. It only deepened it, isolating them on an island of unresolved grief as the world moved on around them. This isolation forged Elias. As he grew into a young man, the nebulous pain of his childhood coalesced into a singular driving purpose. He chose a career in investigative journalism, not for fame or fortune, but to acquire a specific set of skills. He learned how to meticulously follow paper trails, how to coax information from reluctant sources, and how to see the patterns that others overlooked. His quiet intensity and obsessive attention to detail made him a formidable reporter. Every solved case, every uncovered truth was merely practice for the one investigation that truly mattered, the one that had defined his entire existence from the age of 5. Survivor's guilt was a constant gnawing companion. Elias would lie awake at night, tormented by the arbitrary cruelty of fate. He had been too young, too small to go on that camping trip. He had cried, his mother once told him, wanting to go with his big brother. That simple fact, that childish tantrum, was the reason he was alive and David was not. He felt an immense crushing weight of responsibility to live a life worthy of two, and this guilt became the engine of his relentless quest. Finding the truth wasn't just about closure for his family. It was a penance, a way to justify his own existence in the face of his brother's inexplicable erasure. For retired Sheriff Brody, the Pathfinder case was a ghost that haunted his waking hours and stalked his dreams. In his small, quiet house filled with woodworking projects he never finished, one room was dedicated to the disappearance. He had kept copies of every report, every photograph, every map. He would spend entire days staring at the evidence, the faces of the smiling boys, mocking his failure. The logical, orderly world he had built his career on had been shattered by that silent, empty meadow. He felt the weight of 17 vanished lives as a personal failing, a puzzle he was given to solve, but whose pieces were fundamentally, maddeningly incomplete. One detail in particular clung to him like a burr, a sensory memory that had been dismissed by everyone at the time. He never forgot the smell in the air at the campsite on that first day. It wasn't the scent of pine or damp earth. It was a faint, sharp, sterile odor, like the air after a powerful electrical discharge, reminiscent of ozone. There had been no storm, no sign of a lightning strike, yet the smell had been distinct. He had mentioned it in his preliminary notes, but it was deemed irrelevant and never made it into the final report. For 27 years, that anomalous scent had lingered in his mind, a loose thread he could never stop pulling. The collective grief of the other families splintered over the decades. Some, desperate for a tangible target for their anger, filed a lawsuit against the National Scout Organization for negligence, a legal battle that dragged on for years before being dismissed. Others simply moved away from Silver Creek, unable to bear the constant silent reminders of their loss. A small core group of parents, including the Vances, formed a fragile support network meeting once a month in a church basement. They were a dwindling club of shared sorrow, their conversations circling the same unanswerable questions, their bond forged in a tragedy that had no end. Once he had the credentials and the resources, Elias began his own formal, methodical investigation. He spent his savings on filing Freedom of Information Act requests for every government document related to the case, no matter how tangential. He re-interviewed every surviving family member, every original search party volunteer, and every law enforcement officer who would speak to him, listening for inconsistencies, for memories softened or altered by time. On weekends, he would drive to Black Ridge, hiking the same trails, trying to feel what the scouts might have felt, searching for an answer the forest had held secret for nearly 3 decades. He was often haunted by a specific memory from when he was 15. He had come home from school to find the house unusually quiet. He found his mother in David's room, sitting on the edge of the perfectly made bed, clutching his brother's neatly folded scout uniform to her chest. She wasn't sobbing loudly, but was consumed by a silent, convulsive grief that shook her entire body. Seeing her profound, unending pain in that moment galvanized him. His quest was no longer an abstract obsession. It was a concrete mission. He had to find an answer, not just for himself, but to finally, mercifully, end his mother's vigil. His path was paved with frustration and indifference. To the current staff at the Black Ridge Sheriff's Department, he was a nuisance, a journalist fixated on a fossil of a case that had no budget, no leads, and no hope of being solved. Federal agencies sent back heavily redacted documents or form letters stating no records were found. The world had moved on, and its bureaucratic machinery had no patience for a man trying to reverse the flow of time. Each slammed door, each dismissive phone call, only served to harden his resolve, turning his search into a solitary crusade against the apathy of forgetting. Yet beneath the layers of cynicism and exhaustion, a stubborn ember of hope refused to be extinguished. It wasn't the naive hope that David might be found alive. That dream had died long ago. It was a more mature, more desperate hope for narrative, for a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. He simply needed to know what happened. An accident, an abduction, something strange and inexplicable. Any answer was better than the suffocating vacuum of the unknown. He believed that the truth, no matter how horrific, was the only thing that could transform his brother from a question mark back into a person. And so, by 2006, Elias Vance was a man entirely consumed. His small apartment was not a home, but an investigation headquarters, a physical manifestation of his 27-year obsession. The maps on his wall were a testament to thousands of hours of study, the reports yellowed from countless readings. The time gap had not weakened his resolve, it had distilled it into a potent singular focus. He was a sentinel, standing watch over a cold, forgotten mystery, waiting for a single crack in the wall of silence, completely unaware that the ground beneath the forest was about to shift and provide it. The hum of the ground-penetrating radar had given way to the guttural roar of a yellow backhoe. Elias Vance stood at the edge of the freshly cleared patch of forest, the raw, earthy scent of upturned soil sharp in the cool morning air. Detective Rossi was beside him, her arms crossed, her expression a mask of professional neutrality that couldn't quite conceal the tension in her jaw. A perimeter had been established, and a handful of deputies moved with quiet purpose, their presence a stark, official intrusion into the ancient quiet of Black Ridge. The forest loomed around them, a silent green colossus that had held its secret for 27 years. For Elias, this patch of scarred earth felt like the center of the universe, a place where time had finally stopped running away from him. With each methodical scoop of the backhoe's bucket, Elias's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The machine bit into the earth, tearing away layers of soil, roots, and rock that had lain undisturbed for decades. He watched, transfixed, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his knuckles white. This was the agonizing precipice between hope and despair. For years, his search had been an intellectual exercise, a battle with paper and fading memories. Now, it was brutally physical. The vibration of the engine traveled from the soles of his feet up through his entire body, a seismic tremor that mirrored the shaking in his own soul. He was digging up a ghost, and he had no idea what face it would wear. Then came the sound. It wasn't the dull thud of earth or the grating scrape of rock, but a sharp, resonant clang of metal on metal that sliced through the air, causing the operator to immediately kill the engine. In the sudden, ringing silence that followed, every head turned. The deputies froze, their hands instinctively moving closer to their belts. Rossi took a half step forward, her eyes narrowed on the shallow pit. A corner of something dark and unnatural was now visible, caked in mud but unmistakably artificial. The forest held its breath, and in that shared, silent moment, the abstract possibility of a discovery became a stark and terrifying reality. The ground had finally offered up a piece of its puzzle. Rossi waved two of her deputies forward with shovels. "Easy," she commanded, her voice low but carrying with absolute authority. "Let's see what we have." The slow, careful work of unearthing the object began. The scrape of shovels against the buried surface was the only sound, a rhythmic, nerve-wracking countdown. Elias felt a profound sense of vertigo, as if the world was tilting on its axis. He forced himself to breathe, the cold air burning his lungs. This was the point of no return. Whatever lay buried here would irrevocably alter the narrative of his entire life, either by providing a definitive, terrible end or by opening a door to a mystery far deeper and stranger than he had ever allowed himself to imagine. Slowly, the shape was revealed. It was a heavy, circular steel hatch, nearly 4 feet in diameter, its surface pitted and scarred with deep orange rust. It was set flush into a thick slab of reinforced concrete, a structure that had no right to exist in the middle of a national forest, miles from any known road or building. A series of massive corroded bolts held it shut, and a recessed wheel lock was frozen in place by decades of decay. This wasn't a piece of forgotten machinery or a simple septic tank cover. It was an entrance, deliberately constructed, deliberately hidden, and built to withstand immense force. It was a silent iron sentinel guarding a secret buried deep within the earth. Elias stared, his mind struggling to process the impossible sight. A cold dread, colder than the morning air, washed over him, followed by a surge of adrenaline so powerful it made him lightheaded. He had spent his life chasing shadows, and now he was confronted with a solid, tangible object that defied all logic. He looked at Rossi and saw her professional composure finally shatter. Her eyes were wide, her mouth slightly agape, the confident detective replaced by a woman confronting a complete and utter enigma. They had been looking for the remains of a lost scout troop, but they had found something else entirely, a buried wound in the landscape, a question forged from concrete and steel. Getting the hatch open became an immediate, desperate priority. Crowbars and a hydraulic spreader were brought from the sheriff's vehicle. The deputies, their faces grim with effort, worked on the rusted bolts. The air filled with the sharp protesting groans of tortured metal as they strained against the lock that had held fast for an unknown number of years. Each creak and screech seemed to echo Elias's own internal agony. He felt like he was physically trying to pry open his own past, to force a truth that had resisted for nearly 3 decades. The suspense was a physical weight, pressing down on all of them, suffocating the air in the small clearing. With a final, deafening shriek of tearing metal, one of the main locking bolts sheared off. The hatch, freed from its ancient seal, shifted with a deep, resonant boom. As 2 deputies heaved it open, a wave of air rushed out from the darkness below. It was not the smell of decay or death that he had braced himself for. It was a blast of cold, unnaturally dry air that carried a faint, sterile scent, like the charged atmosphere after a lightning strike, but without the rain. The smell was of ozone and something else, a faint, metallic tang that was both alien and vaguely familiar, triggering a distant, half-formed memory of something retired Sheriff Brody had once told him. Rossi was the first to the edge, her tactical flashlight cutting a brilliant white spear into the absolute blackness. The beam illuminated the top rungs of a narrow iron ladder, its sides slick with a thin film of condensation descending straight down into an impenetrable void. Her light couldn't find the bottom. The shaft appeared to be perfectly cylindrical, its walls smooth and featureless. The air that continued to billow out was frigid, as if it were being exhaled from a deep subterranean lung that hadn't drawn breath in a generation. The discovery of the hatch was shocking, but the sight of this dark, bottomless chasm was profoundly unsettling. Elias moved to stand beside her, his own flashlight adding a second beam to the first, neither of them making a dent in the oppressive darkness. He felt a magnetic pull from the opening, a terrifying allure. This was the place. He knew it with a certainty that transcended logic. This was where the story of Pathfinder Troop 114 had ended, or where it had changed into something else. The silent, empty meadow from 1979 suddenly felt like a lie, a stage set designed to distract from the real event happening just a few feet below the surface. The truth was not in the trees, it was down there, waiting in the cold and the dark. "I'm going down," Rossi stated, her voice steady, pulling her back from the brink of whatever personal abyss she was facing. "Forensics and a proper spelunking team are an hour out. I'm not waiting." She turned to her sergeant. "You, me, and Davis. Full gear. Everyone else secures the perimeter. Vance," she said, her gaze locking onto his, "you do not move from this spot. That is not a request." The command was absolute, but her eyes conveyed something more, a shared understanding that they had crossed a threshold into a new and frightening territory, and the old rules might no longer apply. She was a cop, but this was no longer a normal crime scene. He could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. He watched as Rossi and the two deputies geared up, checking their radios, clipping on safety harnesses, and drawing their sidearms. Their movements were practiced and efficient, an island of procedure in a sea of the impossible. One by one, they swung onto the ladder and began their descent. Their flashlight beams cast frantic dancing shadows on the walls of the shaft before being swallowed by the darkness. Elias was left at the lip of the abyss, the cold air washing over his face, listening to the fading sounds of their boots on the iron rungs, until all that remained was the whisper of static from the radio on the sergeant's belt, and a silence that felt older than the trees. The minutes stretched into an eternity for Elias, each one a separate, agonizing lifetime. He stood at the edge of the chasm, listening to the disembodied whisper of radio static and the rustle of wind in the pines. The cold air rising from the shaft felt ancient and wrong, carrying a sterile scent that scraped at the back of his throat. He paced the perimeter of the opening, a caged animal drawn to the very thing that terrified him. Every pop and crackle from the sergeant's radio sent a jolt of adrenaline through him, a painful oscillation between the hope of a definitive answer and the dread of a truth too terrible to bear. This waiting, this powerlessness, was a unique form of torture, a purgatory built from 27 years of unanswered questions. Finally, Rossi's voice crackled through the speaker, clipped and strained by distance and something else. Disbelief. We've reached the bottom. It's a corridor, concrete, perfectly smooth. A pause filled with the hiss of static. There's no dirt, no rubble. It looks like it was poured yesterday. Her words painted a picture that made no sense. Elias had envisioned a cave, a forgotten mine shaft, or a crude bunker. He had prepared himself for the grim reality of a tomb. But a pristine, modern-looking corridor buried for decades beneath the forest floor was an impossibility, a detail so bizarre it felt like a hallucination. The investigation had just begun, and already the foundation of logic was starting to crumble. Down in the oppressive darkness, Rossi swept her flashlight beam along the corridor walls. The concrete was seamless, cool, and unnervingly clean, showing no signs of water damage or the slow decay of time. It extended for about 50 yards before terminating in a solid steel door, the kind you'd see on a bank vault or a military installation. The air was frigid and utterly still, muffling the sound of their own breathing and the crunch of their boots. This wasn't a shelter, it was a laboratory, a tomb sealed with industrial precision. Her training screamed that this was a crime scene, but her instincts whispered that it was something else entirely, something far outside the scope of her experience. The door was the next insurmountable obstacle. It had no visible handle or keypad, only a complex circular locking mechanism in the center that resembled an iris. It was clear that brute force would be useless against it. Detective Rossi examined its surface, her light revealing no maker's mark, no serial number, nothing to identify its origin. It was a blank, impassive face of steel, guarding its secrets with silent, absolute authority. The pressure of the 27-year-old mystery of the 17 vanished souls seemed to emanate from the cold metal. She felt a profound sense of being an intruder in a place that was never meant to be found, a place that operated by its own inscrutable rules. Up on the surface, the fragmented reports of a sealed high-tech door sent Elias into a spiral of frantic impatience. He was so close, yet separated by 100 feet of darkness and a wall of unyielding steel. He confronted the sergeant supervising the perimeter, his voice tight with desperation. "I have to go down there. That's my brother's story you're uncovering." The sergeant, a man bound by procedure, held up a firm hand. "Detective Rossi's orders were clear, Mr. Vance. It's too dangerous. We don't know what we're dealing with." The resistance was a physical blow, fueling Elias's internal conflict between his journalistic instincts for patience and the raw, primal need of a brother to know. Below, Rossi's team discovered a small, recessed panel near the door's frame. After prying it open, they found not complex wiring but a simple, heavy-duty manual override lever. With a coordinated three-man effort, they threw their weight against it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, grinding groan that vibrated through the floor, the circular iris in the door began to retract. It wasn't the rusty shriek of old metal, but the smooth, powerful hiss of dormant hydraulics. As the aperture widened, a wave of even colder air washed over them, carrying the distinct smell of ozone. They stood poised at the threshold, weapons drawn, peering into a new, larger darkness beyond. Their flashlight beams sliced into a vast circular chamber, and the sight that met their eyes defied all expectation. The room was immense, easily 100 feet in diameter, and the walls were lined with rows of stark metal shelving. There were no signs of a struggle, no discarded equipment from a hasty evacuation, no human remains. The scene was one of sterile, meticulous order. It wasn't a place of death or imprisonment. It felt like a storeroom, an archive, or a museum. The sheer strangeness of it, the chilling and deliberate organization, was more terrifying than any scene of violence Rossi could have imagined. This place wasn't an accident. It was a design. As they cautiously moved into the chamber, the purpose of the shelving became horrifyingly clear. On hooks and in neatly arranged stacks were the personal belongings of the entire Pathfinder troop. Backpacks hung in a row, each with a faded name tag still attached. Canteens, mess kits, and rolled-up sleeping bags were organized with military precision. A half-finished whittling project, a small wooden bird, sat on one shelf next to a pocket knife. It was a perfectly preserved collection of lives interrupted, a silent, heartbreaking testament to the 17 people who had been brought to this place. The objects were not evidence of a crime. They were exhibits in an incomprehensible gallery of loss. Detective Rossi felt a wave of vertigo, her mind struggling to categorize the scene. Every instinct she possessed was screaming that this was wrong on a fundamental level. A killer might take a trophy, but this was different. This was the careful curation of 17 entire lives stored away in the dark. Who would do this? For what purpose? The clinical nature of the display ruled out a crime of passion. It suggested a motive so alien, so far beyond the spectrum of human depravity she had ever encountered, that it left her feeling utterly unmoored. For the first time in her career, she had no frame of reference, no theory, not even a wild guess that could explain the cold, orderly horror surrounding her. In the precise center of the chamber floor, their beams converged on the final, most baffling display. 17 scout neckerchiefs, the iconic gold and brown of the Pathfinders, were laid out in a perfect circle. They were clean, pressed, and arranged, as if for a solemn ceremony. And in the middle of that circle, placed upon a small, dark cloth, was a single, antique brass compass. As Rossi knelt for a closer look, she saw that its needle was not pointing north. It was spinning, rotating clockwise at a smooth, constant, and impossible speed, humming with a faint, silent energy that seemed to make the air around it shimmer. It was a violation of physics, a quiet miracle of wrongness at the heart of the mystery. Lying just outside the circle of neckerchiefs was a small, leather-bound journal, its pages seemingly untouched by time or moisture. Rossi picked it up with a gloved hand, her heart pounding in her chest. On the weathered cover, embossed in faded gold leaf, was a name that made the cold air freeze in her lungs: David Vance. She took a deep breath, the professional mask she wore threatening to crack. She keyed her radio, her voice unsteady for the first time. "Sergeant, patch me through to Vance, now." The static hissed for a moment before she spoke again, her words directed at the man waiting at the top of the abyss. "Elias, we found something of your brother's." The sound of his brother's name, spoken from the depths of the earth after 27 years of silence, hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. He staggered back from the edge of the opening, his knees weak. The world narrowed to the sound of Rossi's voice coming from the radio. A voice from a tomb, a voice that was about to deliver the verdict on his entire life's purpose. The deputies around him fell silent, their faces a mixture of professional curiosity and human sympathy. He could feel their eyes on him, but he saw nothing but the darkness of the pit, a darkness that had finally given up a name he thought he might never hear again. Rossi opened the journal to the last entry. The handwriting was a neat, childish cursive, the ink still a crisp blue. The date at the top of the page was July 14, 1979. Her voice, broadcast to the surface, was a low, reverent whisper as she read David Vance's final words aloud. The humming is getting louder. Everyone is awake now, but no one is scared. Mr. Miller says it's beautiful. She paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing with the last chilling lines. We can see the light through the floor of the tent. It's not in the sky. It's coming from the ground. It feels warm. It's calling us home. The words hung in the cold forest air, an impossible explanation that answered nothing and questioned everything. The meticulous archive, the spinning compass, and the final dreamlike entry from a 10-year-old boy converged into a single terrifying point. This was not a story of abduction, murder, or a secret government project. It was something else. As Rossi stared at the spinning needle and Elias stared into the dark hole, they both arrived at the same chilling realization. The investigation into the disappearance of Pathfinder Troop 114 was over. A new search had just begun, a search for the meaning of a word like home, and the nature of a light that calls from beneath the earth. Ignoring the sergeant's protests, Elias scrambled past him, his hands grabbing the cold, slick rungs of the ladder before anyone could react. The journalist, the pragmatist, the man who had spent a lifetime chasing paper trails, was gone. In his place was a child running into the dark after his brother. He descended with a reckless speed, the beam of his headlamp a frantic bouncing circle on the smooth walls of the shaft. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of ozone and ancient stone. His own ragged breaths and the frantic pounding of his heart were the only sounds. A desperate drumbeat counting down the final seconds of a 27-year-long question. He was plunging into the heart of his own lifelong wound. A chasm of not knowing, finally ready to face whatever lay at the bottom. He stumbled off the final rung into the corridor and ran toward the light spilling from the open vault door. When he entered the chamber, the sight stopped him cold, stealing the breath from his lungs. It was a mausoleum of memory, a shrine to stolen youth. He saw the row of backpacks, their canvas faded, but their name tags still legible. He saw a small stack of comic books, a half-eaten bag of licorice, all arranged with a chilling, curatorial precision. Detective Rossi stood aside, her face etched with a profound, weary empathy, watching as Elias reached out a trembling hand and touched a green backpack with the name D. Vance, written in a familiar, childish scrawl. In that single touch, the chasm of 27 years collapsed into a single, excruciating moment of connection. Rossi silently held out the small leather journal. Elias took it, his fingers tracing the faded gold letters of his brother's name. He opened it to the last page and read the words for himself, his brother's voice a clear echo in the silent chamber. "It's calling us home." The phrase was no longer a mystery, it was a testament. He looked up from the page to the perfect circle of scout neckerchiefs on the floor and to the impossible, spinning compass at its center. The rational framework he had built his life upon, the relentless pursuit of logical answers, crumbled into dust. He was standing in a place where the rules of his world did not apply, a place where a light from the ground could call 17 souls home. As Elias knelt beside the circle, his grief a palpable weight in the frigid air, the low hum from the compass suddenly intensified. The brass needle, which had been spinning at a steady pace, accelerated into a dizzying, silent blur. A soft, blue-green light, the exact color of foxfire, began to pulse from the artifact, casting long, dancing shadows across the chamber walls. The sterile air began to crackle with an unseen energy, raising the hair on their arms. The compass was no longer just a strange object. It was awakening, responding to a presence or a memory it had not felt in nearly 3 decades. The silent tomb was coming alive, and the final secret was about to be revealed. The light coalesced above the compass, blossoming into a shimmering, 3-dimensional projection in the center of the chamber. It was a ghostly, translucent window into another time. Elias and Rossi watched, frozen in disbelief, as the figures of the Pathfinder scouts appeared within the light. They were not screaming or afraid. Their young faces were filled with a serene, hypnotic wonder. They walked in a slow procession toward a column of the same ethereal light, which seemed to emanate from the very ground of the meadow. They saw Scoutmaster Miller turn, a calm smile on his face, as he guided the last boy forward. Through the shimmering veil, they caught impossible glimpses of a world beyond, a sky of swirling violet nebulae and landscapes of crystalline geometry. The vision flared, and the hum rose to a deafening, bone-jarring roar that vibrated through the concrete floor. The entire chamber shuddered violently, and a fine dust began to rain down from the ceiling as hairline cracks spider-webbed across the walls. The energy being released was tearing the ancient structure apart. Rossi, her survival instinct screaming, grabbed Elias's arm. "We have to go, now!" But Elias was transfixed, his eyes locked on the image of his brother, David, who had turned within the light, his familiar grin breaking across his face before he was enveloped. It was not a cry for help. It was a goodbye. The vision was a gift, a final, impossible moment of closure. Rossi physically dragged the unresisting Elias back into the corridor as the chamber groaned like a dying beast. They scrambled up the ladder, the sounds of shearing metal and cracking rock echoing from the depths below. Just as they tumbled out onto the forest floor, a deep final boom erupted from the shaft, followed by the percussive roar of a total collapse that sent a plume of dust and frigid air billowing into the night. The entrance was gone, sealed by tons of earth and rock. The secret was buried again, this time forever. Elias lay on the ground, covered in dirt, looking not at the sealed hole, but up at the star-filled sky. The frantic obsession was gone, replaced by a profound, heartbreaking calm. He hadn't found what he was looking for. He had found something better. He had found peace. In the immediate aftermath, a profound silence descended upon the clearing, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the pines and the distant panicked shouts of the deputies who had witnessed the collapse. Elias lay on the cool earth, the dust from the chasm settling on him like a shroud, his gaze fixed on the indifferent stars. The frantic energy that had propelled him for 27 years had vanished, leaving behind a hollow, aching calm. Beside him, Detective Rossi slowly pushed herself to her knees, her face a pale mask of shock and disbelief. She stared at the fresh mound of earth that had sealed the abyss, a tombstone for a truth too vast and strange for any official report. The forest had reclaimed its secret, and in doing so had granted them an impossible, terrifying grace. The search was over. The official report was a masterpiece of professional omission. Detective Rossi documented the discovery of a previously unknown, unstable subterranean structure and the subsequent geological collapse that made further investigation impossible. The case of Pathfinder Troop 114 was officially closed, the cause of their disappearance listed as undetermined, a sterile label for a cosmic mystery. But for Rossi, the world was no longer a place of neat, logical conclusions. The memory of the spinning compass and the spectral light was a permanent crack in the foundation of her reality. She now moved through her days with the new awareness of the vast, unknowable spaces that exist just beneath the surface of the ordinary, forever haunted and humbled by the knowledge that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. Elias returned to his apartment, the cluttered space that had served as his obsessive command center for so long. For the first time, he saw the walls not as a work in progress, but as a cage built from grief. Methodically, he began to dismantle it. He carefully took down the maps of Black Ridge, the yellowed newspaper clippings, and the faded photographs of the smiling boys. He packed them away, not with a sense of defeat, but with the gentle reverence of a final farewell. The ghost that had shared his home for his entire life was finally at peace. The crushing weight of the unknown had been lifted, replaced by the simple, heavy truth of loss. He could finally mourn his brother, not as a question mark, but as a boy who had answered a call from the stars. He drove to his mother's house, the small leather-bound journal resting on the passenger seat beside him. He didn't try to explain the impossible vision or the chamber of memories. He simply handed her the journal and told her what he knew to be true in his soul. David had not been afraid. He was with his friends, on the greatest adventure of all, and he had found his way home. As his mother traced the letters of her son's name on the cover, a single tear rolling down her cheek, Elias saw the flicker of a 27-year vigil finally extinguish in her eyes. It was not the answer they had ever expected, but it was a form of peace, an acceptance that their boy belonged to a story far grander and more mysterious than their grief had ever allowed them to imagine. Months later, standing at the edge of Silver Creek Lake, Elias skipped a flat stone across the water's surface, watching it dance until it sank into the deep. He no longer felt the gnawing guilt of the one left behind. The vision in the chamber, a final, impossible gift from his brother, had severed that anchor. He had been given a glimpse into a reality beyond his comprehension, a confirmation that the universe was far stranger and more beautiful than he had ever known. He didn't have the answers the world would demand, but he had the answer he needed. His brother was not lost. He was part of a different story now, one written in starlight and silence. And for the first time since he was 5 years old, Elias Vance felt free. The mystery of Black Ridge National Forest endured, solidifying into a legend whispered with a new kind of reverence. For the world, it remained an unsolved tragedy. But for two people, a journalist and a detective, it was a shared sacred secret. They had stood at the threshold of the impossible and looked through, and the experience had irrevocably changed them. They understood that some truths are not meant to be captured in evidence lockers or headlines, but are felt in the deep, quiet places of the heart. The forest kept its silence, the ground held its secrets, and the story of the 17 souls who walked into a light from the earth became a quiet testament to the profound and unending mystery of existence itself.